We're offering this forum from our perspective as a faith community that believes we are all created in God's image. We are all beloved children of God. Our LGBTQ siblings are an integral part of our families, our communities, our society, and they enjoy the same civil and human rights and right to dignity that we all do. That's what our church believes. And we know this is not the reality in our country today. What can we do to make it the reality in our country and our county and our communities? That's our topic for today. And to set the stage, I just wanted to mention that Maryland and Montgomery County have done some good things. They've taken some good steps. In 2023, Governor Wes Moore declared that Maryland is a sanctuary state for gender-affirming care. And Maryland passed the Trans Health Equity Act so that Maryland Medicaid will cover gender-affirming care. This isn't the case in many other states. The Montgomery County Council approved an LGBTQ Bill of Rights in 2020 and passed a resolution in 2023 condemning anti-transgender acts and hate crimes and affirming Montgomery County as an inclusive county. And then the county just released in August a landmark survey of the LGBTQ community, which took an in-depth look at what the issues are and what that population is, and made some recommendations about things we can do. And the County Council's Office of Legislative Affairs, under Council Vice President Kate Stewart's guidance, just issued another report looking in depth at the question of transgender care and its availability or lack of availability in Montgomery County. So these are all great steps. They set a direction. But these studies also revealed significant gaps in healthcare, in social services, and in things like basic inclusiveness in schools, in faith communities, in other kinds of organizations. 70% of the LGBTQIA plus community in Montgomery County said they feel safe in Montgomery County. But sadly, respondents also said they feel least comfortable, can you guess where? In faith communities, yeah. So this is a real issue for us, for sure. Now, this is a large and complex topic, how we can support the LGBTQ plus community. We are only going to begin to discuss it today. Many of us are just beginning to learn about it, and I'm one of them. But we know that this issue touches us all because we all have friends, family, colleagues, pastors, teachers who are in this community. It's an integral part of our broader community, siblings. So it behooves all of us to understand the issues, pay attention, and do what we can to help. We have a great panel today of faith leaders and government leaders who are going to help us delve into these issues. Dr. Amena Johnson is here on the screen. She is the liaison for the county government with the LGBT community in Montgomery County. And then Kate Stewart is the county council vice president, and she's also a leader on these issues, and she'll tell you about that. The Reverend Ali Casey Bell, can you see him? Ali? Ali is the Minister for Congregational Life and Engagement at Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Kensington. And this is a welcoming congregation in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. And the Reverend Will Ed Smith is the lead pastor at Silver Spring United Methodist Church. He's right here on the screen. Hi, Will. And that is also a reconciling congregation in the Methodist tradition. I'm very happy that today we have participation with our youth leaders from St. John's. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to turn to each of our panelists first and ask them to introduce themselves briefly and highlight one key issue, one really important thing that they want to be sure we dive into in our discussion today and that they would like you to take away when you leave. And then I'm going to turn to our youth leaders after I ask a couple foundational questions to start the Q&A. We would ask that people who are online, you can ask questions in the chat. And when it comes time to ask questions from the audience, we have a mic right here. If you can come up and use the mic, people online can't hear you if we don't use the mic. So with that, I'll stop and I will turn first. Amena, if you're ready, I'd like to turn to you first to introduce yourself and tell us one really important theme or issue that you want to make sure we look at today in the discussion in 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you all so much for having me. I apologize if my voice goes in and out. I am a little sick, so that's why I'm not there in person today. Again, my name is Amena Johnson. My pronouns are she and her. And I think the one important thing that I'd like folks to take from today is to meet LGBTQ people where they are. And what I mean by that is that we need to meet people where their needs are and not come in with preconceived expectations. I often say that, our job, my job in the county, people's job in faith communities is to serve people, right? You talked about hunger in the last one. LGBTQ people are hungry, right? LGBTQ people do need to be housed, and you need to meet folks where they are. And it doesn't, I always say, you can figure out what the acronym means later, but just meet people where they are and make sure they have their basic needs met, because I think that that's something that we can all agree on. LGBTQ people deserve to live happy and healthy lives, just like the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, Amena. And now I'd like to turn to County Council Vice President Kate Stewart to introduce herself, please.
Do I need to? Oh, it's on. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Stewart. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am glad to be here with all of you today. I serve on the Montgomery County Council this year as the vice president, as well as the District 4 representative. That includes North Bethesda, Kensington, Garrett Park, parts of Chevy Chase, and pretty much Silver Spring inside the Beltway. I'm glad to be here today with all of you. And, as I think about the one thing I'd like us to take away from today and work on together is a quote actually that I have hanging in my office. It's something that Jamie Raskin said a number of years ago. And the quote is, "Life is hard enough with all the natural misfortunes that we don't need to compound it with socially created injustice. The role of government should be to liberate people from injustice as much as possible." And I would say not just liberate people, but to help facilitate, to make sure that each and every one of us can live our lives to our full potential. And so I'd like to talk about today and take away from today how we can all work together to make sure that our government here in Montgomery County is living up to that for our LGBTQ plus community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Ali, thank you. If you would.
Okay. Hi, I'm the Reverend Ali Casey Bell. My pronouns are he, they, or Reverend Ali. I'm a dark-skinned Black trans man who is wearing a rainbow stole and a corduroy jacket that is like a brownish color. And I am so happy to be here with you today. Something that I'd like for us to dig into or take away, I think, is our shared humanity. It's important to me for people to understand that liberation comes when we are working together towards liberation. And that means everyone doing the work of being people who believe in the freedom and justice and caring and equity for other people. And that is the only way we'll all be liberated, the only way we'll all get to beloved community.
Thank you. You all are doing a great job staying under 5 minutes. Will, please.
Good morning or afternoon, friends. My name is Will Ed Green. I am the lead pastor at Silver Spring United Methodist Church, and I will do my best to keep us under that 5-minute limit, as my other fellow panelists have done. I am a queer United Methodist clergy person originally from Arkansas, who, because of injustice within religious systems, found myself forcibly moved from Arkansas to Chicago and now the East Coast, where I've been for the last 7.5 years. As I think about what I hope that we'll begin to take away, I'm particularly interested in helping congregations move beyond what I would call transactional inclusion or performative justice, which is to say, I know many church communities that talk about these issues and make public statements of inclusion because they're trying to quote unquote grow the church or remain relevant. When we are including people because we're simply trying to make ourselves feel good about ourselves or look good on paper, we're not doing the hard work of leaning into the tension theologically and socially that exists as we work to truly build beloved community. And if we want to create spaces where queer folk are actively not just included, but where their equity and liberation is sought, we have to move beyond that transactional inclusion and performative justice.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Will. And one theme that I heard come through very clearly from all four of our panelists, which we also I talked about in my opening remarks, is the fact that the LGBTQIA plus community enjoys the same human and civil rights and the same respect for dignity as everyone else. And if that's not the case anywhere in our county, then we have to work with our government leaders and our faith leaders to make sure that it is. So we can certainly dig into that. But before we get started on that theme, just so that we all have the language we need to discuss these issues, I wonder if one of our panelists might help us, or a couple of our panelists might help us understand the letters, LGBTQIA+. I don't know who might want to take the first crack. Looks like Ali, you might.
So I want to start by saying, depending on where you got on the bus of understanding LGBTQIA plus identities, you may realize like the letters have grown. And what's that about, right? Because it just used to be lesbian and gay, and then it was lesbian, gay, bisexual, and it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And now we have QIA, and we're like, what? And S2, I won't even get into it, or maybe I will, but I want to invite you to take a moment with that feeling of like, why is this growing so much? Why is it such alphabet soup? And take a moment and just like lean into that feeling of discomfort and then breathe in that we're all learning together. So let's all just like breathe in. And we're gonna breathe out the perfection of trying to do everything right. Because when you are so like caught up in trying to get it right, nothing can come in. Nothing can come in. You're just like focused on that one thing, getting it right. So L is lesbian, G is gay. If you need definitions for these terms, let me know. B is bisexual, T is transgender. And I want to stop at bisexual and transgender because they're more expansive terms. For bisexual, there are people who are pansexual. That's a newer term that we use. And basically that means people who have an attraction and inclination of loving people, not based on their body parts, but based on the people that they are. So pansexual, LGBTQ, transgender, it's an umbrella term. There are transgender people who are living at one or the other end of the binary of gender, meaning like transgender people who identify as trans men, like I'm a trans man or a trans woman. So man and woman are the ends of the binary. And then in the middle, there are people who are non-binary, genderqueer, agender, lots of different genders, bigender, and many different ways in which they experience their gender. And all of that is under the transgender umbrella, LGBTQ. Q is queer. Sometimes queer is a word that used to be, depending on when you got on the bus, a really bad word that people used as a slur against gay people. And then it was reclaimed and used as a word of power. And it is a political word mostly. Queer is political first, saying that I recognize my identity as something outside of this binary of identities that we call heterosexual or homosexual. But queer is also about reclaiming power and about not allowing people to like box you into this idea of what they think your sexuality may be. So you are determining what your sexuality is. Other people define queer differently. We talk about queering things like theology and religion and queering the system. Queering means just taking something that is static and the same and injecting it with something that is, I want to say different, but vibrant and changing and malleable. I would say. Queer, and sometimes the Q is people understand it as meaning questioning, people who are still understanding their identity. QI. I is intersex. Those are people who are born with more than one sex, more than one sex. So we used to call those people hermaphrodites, but the correct term is intersex. A is for asexual. Sometimes the A is also for ally, depending on who you're talking to. And those people who are asexual are people who experience, depending on the realm of asexuality, because asexuality is a whole spectrum. But basically, there are people who are experiencing sexuality as something that is not necessarily performed in a performative, like body part way, but more in a mental and connective way in that way. And then there's S, 2S. Those are two-spirited people. That's what's living in the plus. And I bet you the youth group might have some more acronym things. Y'all have any more? Did I cover them pretty good?
I think you did a great job, and
All right.
I thank you so much for that. And then I want to point you all to this document, which St. John's prepared as background for this event. It also has a little shorthand, just giving you the background and some of the history of these terms. The other thing I'd like to touch on just briefly, if one of you would be willing, is the pronouns, right? Pronouns. Why pronouns are so very important. And I don't know if one of the other panelists would like to take a crack at that. Amena, Will?
Sure. Pronouns are important because you want to call people who they are, right? You cannot assume that someone that looks like me, uses the pronoun she and her, even though I do. And I want to say something about pronouns, they and them. They and them pronouns are absolutely singular pronouns. They do not have to be plural pronouns. For example, after this meeting that you're having in the church, if someone leaves their coat and Reverend Ann is walking around, she will say, someone is leaving their coat. She's not going to say she left her coat or he left her coat, because we don't know who left their coat. But pronouns are important because we want to call people by who they are and who they would like to be called. And so that is why many of us introduced ourselves with our pronouns. Some of us have our pronouns in our names on our Zoom.
Okay, thank you. It's basically a matter of respect. So with that as background, yes?
And could I
Will?
hop in for just a
Oh,
second?
please. Yes, yes.
And
Sorry,
say
Will.
that pronouns, it's not simply in the way that we address individuals within the religious community, right? It's also in the liturgy we use and the way that we're actively modeling and everything we do, the full recognition of people's humanity. And so, as an example, one of the things that we do at Silver Spring is we've gone through our book of worship as Episcopal cousins, you know what I'm talking about, and we have actively edited every single liturgy we use so that we are using they, them pronouns instead of he, she pronouns, particularly when we're addressing liturgies with children. It's very easy for us to want to gender children from an early age, when children may not fully know who they are yet. And so the more expansive we can be as we're not just talking to people, but the way we're building faith community and modeling faith community from the front, so to speak, the better off our whole community is in practicing this honoring of people's identity.
Thank you, Will. Kate?
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things. One, this fall, and I think almost everybody who's on the panel today were able to join us. The county council did celebrate for the very first time International Pronoun Day this fall. And that's one of the things I hope we talk about in a little bit, but how on the county council, how our county government is really reinforcing the inclusivity and making sure that we're moving forward on these issues. The other thing that when Will was talking made me think about is the use of pronouns, but then also the use of inclusive language. And so, we have a lot of gender terms that we use in our language, but we don't have to. We can move away from that. And so lots of times, I don't want to make assumptions that young people, children have, a mom and a dad, or even two moms or two dads. So lots of times I talk about who's the adult in your life. So these are just an example of how we could use our pronouns, but we can also be really conscious of the language and how we can make all of our language much more inclusive.
Thank you.
I like to talk about pronouns like we talk about names. So often people think, well, this is so-and-so's pronoun, but that's just too hard for me to remember. I'll just call them whatever we see them as, right? And I always ask them, if you know that John's name is John, would you decide to call John Jeffrey? Or would you call John by his name? And they said, well, of course I would call John John. And that's the same thing with pronouns. If you know what someone's pronouns are and you choose to call them something differently, you're basically looking at them and telling them, I don't see you as someone that it matters to me to call by who they believe that they are, to call by your name. Your pronoun is like a name. It matters. So you can like stumble over it and get it wrong. You just correct yourself in the moment. I definitely still misgender people often because I am human and I am learning. And when people change their pronouns, it takes some time to get used to, right? But then I just say, like if like Mary's pronouns are he, him, and I say, oh yeah, Mary, she's so great. And I say, oh no, Mary's pronouns are he, him. Mary, he's wonderful. I really love doing with Mary. And I just go forward. I don't put the effort on the transgender person. I don't like start to apologize all over the place. Just correct yourself and move forward. It makes life so much easier.
Yeah.
This is from a transgender man.
No, thank you. And your point that we're all learning is certainly true. And so we will make mistakes and it's okay. Thank you for that. Well, let me turn now to some of our youth leaders. Riley, would you start the ball rolling with a question?
Hello, my name is Riley. I'm a 10th grader and my pronouns are she, her. And I wanted to start with a question. As you'd mentioned before, using the word queer, I've heard people use the word queer and gay as like an umbrella term or just in general when referring to the LGBTQIA+. Is that appropriate, and what should we like have in mind when using those terms?
That's an interesting question. I think that it depends is the answer. I generally, when I'm talking to my queer friends, my LGBTQIA friends, I talk about the queer community just because I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible. And I recognize that there is a thing that happens when I also talk about my community as the gay community, because gay in the terms that we just described talks about gay men. So it kind of excludes everyone else in that scenario. So I try to just say LGBTQIA or the alphabet mafia or like LGBTQIA or queer. But it really would depend on the people you were talking to. I haven't seen that be an issue just to say the queer community. And it really, I feel like it depends on the groups of people you're talking to. Anyone else?
Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Riley.
I mean,
Oh,
as
Bill,
as
please.
someone who as someone who identifies primarily as queer, I think one of the things that I would offer is that it's always appropriate to ask if you're speaking to an individual. As long as you're not expecting them to then deconstruct their own oppression. And so I've been in situations, particularly in churches, where I've introduced myself as a queer person, and I've immediately had somebody attack me for calling myself queer, because it makes them uncomfortable, because that tension feels strange. And so as you're feeling this out, particularly as you're meeting new people or you're engaging new communities, it's always okay to ask. Never assume, and never push back against the identity somebody tells you is their own, right? Which can happen a lot, particularly I find in religious communities.
I actually
Thank
have
you,
something
Will.
as well. When I use the word queer, everybody in the LGBTQIA plus community does not identify with the word queer. So I actually used to be one of those people. I do use the word queer to describe myself now because I understand it to be a political identity. So my what I do is I say LGBTQIA plus when I'm speaking at events like this and this sort of thing. But if I'm in community, as in with people in the LGBTQIA plus community, then I use the word queer because I understand that that word does not ring true for everyone. And if I'm in my own LGBTQI plus community and I know that someone doesn't use the word queer, then I won't use it. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you so much. Naeem, do you have a question? No? Amelia?
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm a ninth.
Lisa, can you help her with the mic? It's a little high.
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm a ninth grader. My question for y'all is, do you think that teens can be effective allies to older people? And if so, how?
Do you think that teens can be an effective ally to older people and
If so, how?
if so, how? That's a challenging question.
I actually have a wonderful story about that, about my own coming out as a trans man. My kid is non-binary, and they came out to me as non-binary. And I'd always raise them by saying, you know, I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, I'm a person. And so we already had kind of that language in our family, but I knew that I was more like very, very, very far on the man spectrum than non-binary. And I didn't want to have them be teased or hurt in my transition. So I kind of just stayed in the non-binary like arena. Then my kid came out and was like learning all these things and teaching me all of these things and having such joy in their identity and like showing me how the world has changed and how it is the same. And so I said to my kid, you know, I really am a trans man. I'm really transgender. I just don't know if I should come out yet, or should I wait until you all finish high school? And my kid said, well, you taught us that we have to be who we are. So you need to come out if that's what you are. Like, you have to be who you are. And I feel like that was very effective for me to be able to learn the where the LGBTQIA community in my kids' world is, as opposed to when I came out as a lesbian in 1989, right? So it was really effective for me. And yes, I do believe that teens are effective allies because you know so much about the world and you're empathetic people. I don't think that there's an age limit on allyship.
Thank you.
Allyship is another important theme to get into, but let me give, it's Nate. Would you ask a question? You have a question, I can tell, so please ask.
My name is Nate. I am in ninth grade, and my question is, what is one piece of advice that you wish someone had given you when you were a teen?
For all of you, someone, let's start with our Zoom participants.
One of the things that I might offer, particularly as a queer person, is that, and you've heard some of this theme already, Nate, inclusion is a spiritual discipline. It's an iterative, transformational process. And so embracing the freedom, as you've already heard folks say, to get it wrong, and know that that's okay, as long as you're working towards greater understanding and equity and the liberation of all people. Knowing that it's okay to be gentle with yourself as you're figuring yourself out, as you're figuring your communities out. And trusting that you've got insight and wisdom that the world needs, that your communities need as we're building this beloved community. Too often, as the previous question pointed out, we tend to disenfranchise the voices of the leaders we need most. In every faith community I've served in the 17 years I've been in ministry, the most powerful, effective, thoughtful leaders are our young people. So take that authority and do something with it. The church needs you, and the world does too.
Thank you. Amena, anything on that?
Yeah, so I used to work full-time at Georgetown University, and now I teach there adjunct. And one of the things I often talk to my students about is I wish I had learned this when I was a teenager, that there is no one age that you're just going to magically get life right, right? When I was in high school, it was 18 or 21, and then it was 30, and then it was 40, and now I'm almost 50, and I'm still learning. I'm still changing, and there's no one age where then you're just going to be sailing through life, right? Regardless of whether you come out at a young age or come out at a later age, it's still, you're going to constantly be changing and learning. And I wish I had known that. It would have saved me a lot of trouble, not just in my teen years, but in my early 20s and 30s and that sort of thing. So that would be my advice.
Thank you, Amena. Thank you, Nate. Well, I'd like to turn back to you, Kate, because in your opening remarks, you mentioned how can we in Montgomery County, and then Amena will have a lot to say on this too, I'm sure. How can we in Montgomery County serve our LGBTQ community? And these two reports that came out made some very important points about what's necessary, and we welcome your thoughts on that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. We do have a great deal to do here in our community. As Reverend Ann mentioned earlier, we have made great strides. So I do want to acknowledge, because that work was hard, that people did. And, we always say we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And so people who have been in our community working hard for LGBTQ plus rights, it's really important to acknowledge them. And at the same time, to know we still need to do a great deal more. And these two reports really reflect that. And I want to thank Dr. Amena Johnson, because she really led the effort and authored the report on the survey that was done with the LGBTQ plus community, with input from many people. But if we start with that survey report, we'll see that, even though folks who are LGBTQ plus in our communities, feel we're a welcoming community, they still face huge hurdles. As we talked about before, where they feel they are welcomed here. And one of the things that it also looks at is access to care. One of the basic fundamental things, access to healthcare, is really lacking in our community. And when we look at the trans community here in Montgomery County, and then as we've talked about before, no one just has one identity. And we look at our trans community, plus if they're also part of the BIPOC community, the hurdles people face regarding healthcare access. And when you look at the report, the community survey, it is really shocking to think here in Montgomery County that 4 in 10 trans people say that they haven't been able to find access to care. That a large percentage say that they are fearful, and that's why they've put off care in the last year. Or that nearly half of them, when they did get care, were actually misgendered by their physician. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. What would you feel like if you were seeing a medical professional and they misgendered you? Does that give you faith in a system? Does that make you want to go back to that person and get care? And so those are some of the real obstacles that the survey pointed out, a number of other things. And we also have this Office of Legislative Oversight report. And just to give you some background, Office of Legislative Oversight is a office in the county council, the legislative branch of our government. They are an independent research department, and we can put in requests to do research reports. And one of the things that I did last year when getting into office was ask them to look at LGBTQ plus health access in our community, specifically trans healthcare. And in the report, they came back, and what they basically said is that we are a desert when it comes to access to care for trans individuals and their families. Now think about that again. We are Montgomery County. We are on the doorstep of the nation's capital. And yet we do not have medical access for people who are trans in our community. And this is something that I'm glad we have the report. I knew personally because my son is trans and transitioned in high school. In order to get the care he needed, we needed to go to Columbia, Maryland to see a doctor. And, you know, in our family, we were lucky. I had the flexibility with work. I was able to drive because I was not getting there by public transportation. And so I was able to get him to his appointments. But could you imagine if you had someone in your family that you were driving for appointments all the time to Columbia, Maryland, or into the district, or to Baltimore? And so one of the things that we're really, we have these reports now, and what we want to work on moving forward is to take this information, because one, we need to learn from the community themselves, and that's what the survey report helped us to do. And the research report looking at what we have here together really shows us that moving forward, we need to do much better here in Montgomery County. And so I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, because you're going to be important in raising your voices to help us as we begin our budget process this spring, and look at all the needs we have here in Montgomery County to make sure that we're prioritizing this one.
That's great. And as I recall from the two reports, the issues are around training, first of all, for all physicians, as well as for people serving specifically this community on the issues. Numbers of service providers, there's only a handful, right? And then I think there's something in the works, though, for a new medical clinic. Do you want to talk about that?
So CCI, which is a community clinic here in Montgomery County and Prince George's, is looking at opening really our first LGBTQ plus focused clinic in Montgomery County. And they're looking to do this in downtown Silver Spring, where their clinic is on Georgia Avenue. They have hired a medical director who I've had the fortune to meet to head up this initiative. But basically, this would be the only place we have right now in Montgomery County that would serve this community specifically. And what I want to say also that came out in the report, which is important, is that having this clinic is going to be very important. But in addition to that, we need to make sure that all care we have in Montgomery County is gender affirming care. So whether you're going to see a dentist, you're going to see a dermatologist, or whomever it is, that care should be gender affirming. It shouldn't just be, when we're talking about gender affirming care, we're talking about hormone therapy or something else. We need to make sure that all physicians in our communities know how to care for everyone in our community.
Thank you.
And stay tuned. We're going to have another event with CCI. I think it's going to be the second weekend in February, but we're still working on the date to talk more about their clinic.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to let people know. Amena, may I ask you, from your perspective, in addition to healthcare, the report also made clear there's issues with simple inclusiveness. And there's a question about the need for a community center of some kind in order to provide the community with access to resources and access to a place where they can be comfortable in their community. And also, just generally throughout the county, there's a need for a more inclusive approach. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you see.
Sure. I think Bill was saying something, though, before.
I'm sorry. Did Bill, did you say
Yes,
something?
Ann, thank you. Please, we can do open Q&A later. I just wanted to raise a question that came up on the chat
Yes.
regarding the unhoused within the LGBTQIA plus community. So appreciated the comments about healthcare access, but wondering if any of the panelists would like to comment on the homelessness issue as well.
Sure.
Maybe I can throw that to Amena's way too. Can I, Amena?
I can throw that in.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that, Councilmember Stewart, thank you, did a great job talking about healthcare and other things. I think the biggest thing, as far as those of us that are members of this community can remember, is I think a lot of people have an idea of what Montgomery County is, right? And part of that idea is that people who have lots of resources as far as money and housing and all of those things. Another part of that idea is that folks are pretty progressive, right? Like we live in a progressive area. We're near DC, it's progressive. And I think when you get down to it individually, that's not the case for many people. And in our survey, almost 45% of folks said that they didn't feel safe in the county. And 20, almost a quarter of them said that they didn't feel safe in public, right? And so I think that that is important to remember. And something also about that not feeling safe, we did not do a great job in our survey at getting to people of color communities. I will say that in our next round, we need to make sure that we get more people of color communities. So the point I'd like to make though is if most of the people in that survey were white folks and they were saying they felt unsafe, can you imagine how much higher that number would be if they were people of color? And then to the housing point, I think that gets to it. One, the assumption that LGBTQ people can afford housing. There's another assumption about LGBTQ folks that, because, they are, they might not have kids, they both have jobs. And so they've got the money for housing. Not always the case. And LGBTQ people are single. The person in the comments talked about LGBTQ youth that may experience family rejection. I will tell you a personal story. This person is 18 now, but I met them when they were 17 and they were experiencing family rejection. And there was no place in the county for them to go. They were a trans person who was a brown person, and there was no place for them to go at all. And I am the LGBTQ liaison in Montgomery County, and I cannot find them any permanent or stable place to go. So I think what we need to remember is that as a county, we need to still be learning. I think as members of the county, we need to push our government officials to make sure that there's space for LGBTQ people. And, if LGBTQ people get housing, everybody who needs housing gets housing, right? If LGBTQ people feel welcome, then more people are going to feel welcome. I think that that's, something for us to remember. And LGBTQ youth especially are vulnerable because they're young people, not just because they're LGBTQ. And so I think those are the things that we need to remember. But definitely I would say, make sure that your opinion is known to our county officials about these issues. I see that Pastor Will has his hand up, so I will let him talk.
Please, Will.
I just wanted to highlight some of the numbers from this report. And friends, if you've not seen it, I highly recommend you do. It is particularly damning of the faith community. And as people of faith in this particular forum space, we need to be engaged in this work. So 40% of people who responded said they don't feel comfortable with people knowing their gender identity in houses of worship in Montgomery County. 75% said they don't feel comfortable with people knowing their sexual orientation. There are enough progressive, supposedly inclusive communities in our county that those numbers should not be that high. We have to keep in mind, too, that this particular report, and Dr. Johnson and I were just in a meeting where we were talking about this, got almost no response from up county, right? And so even as we're talking about resource development down counties, downtown Silver Spring and those kinds of places, there are queer people everywhere, including in up county, and trying to get from up county to down county to receive resources, whether that's at a community center or a clinic, for many. Especially if they're experiencing homelessness or other financial or social challenges, is almost impossible. So that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind in our organizing and in our work. The other thing that I just want to highlight really quickly that feels particularly important in this conversation is that the work toward LGBTQIA or queer justice and equity can't simply stop at how we train our greeters on Sunday mornings. If we're truly committed to queer justice and equity, The work that we do within our faith communities is simply practice for how we live, move, organize, and act out in the world, right? Our faith communities become incubators, safe spaces, laboratories where we can mess up like we've been talking about. We can learn, we can be transformed so that we can go out and fight for transformation in our county. That's part of what Beloved Community is all about.
Thank you. And I didn't know if you might want to add something from your perspective as a faith leader on that very question. How do faith communities move from being welcoming to being truly inclusive? Practically, what are the practical things that tell people when they come through our doors that we are inclusive?
I think that
One of-
it's not, about the signs that you put up out front, although they are important. If you put up a rainbow flag or a progressive pride flag, and you haven't done the work of digging into your own homophobia or transphobia or misogyny or racism or any of those things, it only is going to bring people in, but they won't come back again. If like Will said, if the greeters are great and nice and don't ask a million questions about how people's families are developed, that's something that I get quite a bit when I go places without a collar on, like, oh, you're a trans man, or which kid is yours, and how was that kid like? I don't think I've ever asked you how your children were made. I feel like that's a little bit private, not a first conversation thing. So it's about understanding that we have to do the work. And this is, I find the work that we do at at the Unitarian Universalist Association as a part of our congregations, we have, before we can say we're a welcoming congregation, we have like probably about 6 months of work that we have to do within our congregations. Like we have to have trainings, we have to have workshops, we have to have services, and we have to make sure everyone has like name tags that have pronouns and all of those things. And then that's not just dropped. Every year we have to then re-up. Like we have to show we're doing more, show how we are not just saying to the community, we're here for you, come to us, but show how we are being a part of the community and letting the community lead us in our social justice. I think it starts at home. It really, really starts at home in decolonizing the way that we look at families, looking at the ways that we talk about children and their bodies, and the way that we talk about elders and their bodies, and understanding that being a people who are gendered and sexual is normal, and it's the way that we're all created. So removing shame from the conversations about sex and gender is really important. That's something that you can start at home early on, and then staying in community and working in community and doing that committee by committee or with a whole congregation at the same time. It really starts with the basics and the foundations of like, who are we as a people? What have we said that we believe, and how will we live into these values? And then just continuing that conversation.
Thank you so much.
I want to add one thing that I forgot to say. I think it's really important for faith communities to make sure that they're out in the LGBTQ community, going to LGBTQ events. And that's not just Pride. LGBTQ folks have other meetings and events about important community work. And, you know, faith communities should be there, right? Lots of LGBT people don't feel comfortable coming into faith communities because they've had bad experiences themselves personally, not just about an assumption that they're making about faith communities. But so definitely get out into the LGBTQ community and work with them as well.
Thank you. Yes, definitely.
And I, as an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, I also think of like when we talk about words like welcoming versus inclusive, I always think about like welcoming is like, does someone want to come for a visit? Right? That means you're welcoming if someone wants to come for a visit. But as you said, if we're not inclusive, they're not going to stay or come back. Inclusive is when somebody becomes family and you're in community with them and they want to be there and they know they can be there on equal footing with everybody else in the community. So we can be welcoming and put out a flag and say, come visit us. But if we want to be inclusive, that means people are going to come back and we're going to be in true community with them.
Thank you for that. And thank you for mentioning allyship. It's the last thing I want to touch before we turn to Q&A from the audience. What is allyship? And,
Anne, sorry to interrupt.
apologies. I apologize for skipping over the
Oh,
Zoom.
No,
Yeah.
there's so much good, rich stuff here. I think you asked a question about what we could be doing in faith communities. And so there were two things that came to mind. I want to briefly share a story. So I came to DC to serve at Foundry United Methodist Church, which is a historic, welcoming, reconciling church in the DC area. I came as an openly queer man. And when I introduced myself during my interview that way, one of the clergy pulled me aside after the fact, and they said, you know, it's great, you're queer, we love that, but we're not one of those queer churches. So don't expect that we're going to behave or think that way. This is a historic reconciling in the United Methodist tradition. That's our commitment to inclusion community. And yet our leaders were saying, we're not one of those churches. I think we have to disentangle the idea that being committed to inclusion makes us a particular kind of church. We are a gay church. We are a Black church. We are a white church. We are a multilingual church. We're an intergenerational church. We're all of those things together. And being committed to justice for LGBTQIA people does not make us a quote unquote gay church. The other thing that I think I would say that often gets lost, I find particularly in progressive communities where, unlike Reverend Ali's congregation, we may not always be re-upping ourselves in education and training and knowledge, is that remaining deeply rooted to the theological values and underpinnings of these commitments to justice is incredibly important. You know, there are people in particular parts of the church and the faith community that are really good, for instance, at weaponizing scripture. If we don't take the time to dig deep into the words of our faith texts so that we can disarm those particular persons when they begin to weaponize the text to harm people, we're not going to be effective in creating safe spaces for people. So if we're not, you know, I'll speak particularly as somebody rooted in the Christian tradition, if we're not studying the Bible regularly, if we're not reading queer theology, if we're not staying engaged in those conversations so that we have both the language and the knowledge that keeps us secure and grounded when we're coming up against folk that are causing harm, we're not going to be able to be effective allies. So both of those things feel important, right? Remembering that we are a church for all people, and making sure that we're staying grounded and rooted in the things that fuel us in that work.
Thank you, Will. And you mentioned allyship as well. So that's the last thing I would like to ask, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Can you tell us from your perspective, what is allyship and why is it important?
Yeah. So for me, for the different identities that I hold, allyship is really important in the work that I do. One, as a government official, is so that we make sure everyone in our community is valued and respected and, you know, can live their lives, as we talked about before, to the fullest potential. I'm also a parent of a transgender young adult and a queer young woman who's in college. And so for me, it's also being an ally for my children. And what it comes down to first and foremost is first, always listen. You're an ally. Your job is first to listen to the community, to the people who are most impacted and affected, to take your signal from them on what is needed and how we want to proceed. So I think that's really important. And, you know, as a parent, that's not always easy to remember, but it is really important. And I found that with my own children, letting them lead and taking my cues from them, when my son was transitioning, who did he tell? How did he want people to know? Was very important. And again, I just want to go back and thank Dr. Johnson for the incredible work she did on the community survey, because this is going to be invaluable to us, because we have, and it's not an end point, but a beginning, the voices of people in our community most impacted, and their input in that. And then the other thing about allyship is educating ourselves. I think, Reverend, you talked about this before. And, don't make the folks who are in this community also be the educators all the time and the advocates. That's not their job. That is tiring, exhausting, and sometimes you just don't want to do it. And again, I learned that in both of my lives. It was interesting when a story I always hold is when my son first started transitioning in high school, and my mom lived in Florida. And after he told her, he came to me afterwards. He says, I love talking to Nana, but it's just like every conversation doesn't have to come back to the fact that I'm trans. And I don't, it's like, I feel like every time I'm on the phone with her, it's like this, like asking, it's like 101 on being trans. And I think that's really important as allies to remember too. There are so many resources out there. There's the Trevor Project, and they have a great training, actually, if you want to take this to the next level, to actually do a training on allyship, sign up for that. There's HRC. There's so many things out there about how to be a true ally and show up, and make sure you're educating yourself. I think is very, very important. And I think those are the two things for me. And actually, the third thing is really is the standing up. And is being out there. And that sometimes can be difficult, with your either with relatives or with friends, and they say something that is harmful to the LGBTQ plus community, and explain to them why that's harmful is really important. And I think and it takes courage to do that too, sometimes, to confront people. But if we don't do it, it just adds to the misinformation that's out there at one level, and the hate rhetoric that's out there at the other, and the damage that is doing to people we love and to our whole community. And so we really need to listen, educate ourselves, and really push back and dispel on the hateful rhetoric and the misinformation. And that's how I see my job as an ally.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Okay, well, while our other panelists comment briefly, if you have a question, let me ask you just to line up at the mic, and we'll do that immediately after.
In
everyone.
seminary, we talked about allyship versus co-conspirators and co-liberators. And it's great, I believe, to be an ally. We all have to start somewhere. We all start at allyship for something, because none of us have everyone's identity, right? And Kate was dead on about everything she said. And then at some point, you have to up the ante and determine that, like I said before, we're all in this together. We're going to rise and fall together. So you need to be co-liberators, meaning that you are doing the work of dismantling systems that continue to oppress people, the people that you are being a co-liberator with. And they are doing the work to work on the systems that are oppressing you, so that we are liberating each other together. We're co-liberators in the struggle.
Thank you. That's a great way to put it, co-liberators. Anyone else before we turn to audience questions? Will or Amena?
Yeah, I want to thank Reverend Ali for that beautiful transitional idea of allyship. I think one of the things that does is it highlights for us the intersectional nature of all oppression, right? So that when we move from being an ally to the queer community, or an ally to the BIPOC community, or an ally to whomever it might be, to being co-conspirators and co-liberators, suddenly we are all working for one another. And particularly for me, this is important because in the queer community itself, there is what I would call inter-allyship, right? Far too often, we stop at the line of gay or lesbian or transgender, and all of us should be working together. As a white cis man, I have all kinds of privilege that allows me not to have to do that, right? I can be ignorant to, in some ways, if I so choose, the suffering of other people within the queer community. And it's my responsibility to be their co-liberator, their co-conspirator for justice. So allyship doesn't just stop at heterosexual people supporting queer people, right? We are co-conspirators. Thank you again, Reverend Ali, for that. I might borrow that at some point in the near future with one another in the work of justice.
And I
Thank
just want to add just a couple of things because everything everybody has said is wonderful. I think it's really important for people to understand that when you're an ally, you need to examine your own power and privilege. It's going to force you to examine that. And that's okay, because discomfort is where growth begins. And so as an ally, you need to remember that. You're not just here for that. And here's something that's a little controversial when I say it, but allyship is not a friendship. That's not what being an ally is. You can be friends with people and be their allies, but being an ally to someone is not a friendship. Ally is what everyone has said. It's a co-conspirator for liberation. This is not about I'm your friend and that's all I have to do. No, it is absolutely an action word. It's not just a friend meeting for coffee and that sort of thing. It is an action word. So that's all I wanted to add.
Questions? Becky?
Short people. Okay. Hi. I just want to say how grateful I am for this conversation and what each of you brought. So this is my question. What legal assistance is necessary or offered in terms of supporting and equalizing the standing of that particular, see, I'm not even going to get the initials right. You know, what did somebody call it? The alphabet soup?
Right. Alphabet Mafia.
Yeah. What's available in terms of establishing the rights and privilege for people in terms of their relationships, like within marriages, in terms of wills and passing on property? Like if that, and in fact, when I was driving up here today, there was a piece on NPR about a clinic, a center for something to offer that kind of legal assistance. And I'm just wondering, because I heard so much about the access to healthcare. And I guess in terms of stabilizing and making accessible the legal privileges for being in certain types of relationships or of a certain defined gender that are sort of automatic and assumed. And if any of you have had contact or are aware of what's available in terms of resources.
Any thoughts, anybody? Yeah.
I mean, so it's a yes and I'm remembering, Reverend Ali, a conversation that you and I had months ago now about, in particular, the need for care for older persons who are in the process of either having to downsize or protect assets. But I did a funeral for a gentleman about 10 years ago who was killed in a really tragic car accident. He was in the hospital for about a week before he passed away. He was in a domestic partnership, and this was not in Maryland, but was not afforded the same rights for healthcare. So his partner was unable to make decisions for him at the end of his life. The family came in, the family was non-supportive, and basically wrote the partner out of the equation altogether. His partner sat on the sidelines as the person he had spent 35 years of his life with died. So these things happen all the time. It's important to be aware of them. In terms of resources that we need in the county, one of the things I want to highlight, particularly for people who might be experiencing homelessness or other challenges, is that the Real ID laws in this country make it really hard to access certain services. And right now, there aren't very many places in the county, if there are any at all, and Vice Council President Stewart, you might be able to speak to this, where people who don't have their IDs can get their IDs or get their birth certificates changed or those kinds of things. So that's a gap that I think we have, that perhaps there's some opportunity to do some work around.
Yeah, sure. And Amena, you probably have a list of resources and everything. And I will say that, if there are folks, there are, clinics and people who do help with name changes and other things in the county, and we can help connect people to those resources. I do also want to say, though, one of the things that just recently passed that does help people with name changes is that they no longer have to put them in a newspaper to announce them. And so that used to be a big barrier for people who are doing a name change, is that you actually had to put it in I think it was called a paper of standing, if I got that right, Amena. And that's no longer a requirement now, which is huge, I think, for our trans community in changing names. But I don't know, Amena, if you wanted to talk about other resources that are available for folks.
For the folks, sorry, I muted myself. I'm putting a link in the chat to Trans Maryland. Trans Maryland has a name change clinic, and they help folks change their name and get the marker on their IDs changed and that sort of thing. So that in Montgomery County, I mean, they do work in the whole state of Maryland, but in Montgomery County, Trans Maryland is a great resource for those things. I want to come back just quickly to the idea about relationship and the legal things that are put in place, and just point out that this is another place where if LGBTQ people get their liberation, other folks get their liberation. Right now in this country in general, you have to be married to get those things. You have to be legally married in order to get those things. So even for LGBTQIA folks who are married, they get those privileges. But if you're not married, if you've just lived with someone, regardless of your sexual orientation, you don't necessarily get those privileges. Now, we know, like, when it comes to healthcare and visits, you know, if you are a heterosexual couple, people might be like, oh, you can go see this person in a different way. But I just wanted to point out that, and there's nothing wrong with marriage. I am a married person, but the married people have rights and privileges that people who aren't married are. Healthcare is one of them. I shouldn't have to be married to offer, you know, to someone to be on my plan. If a friend needs to be on my plan, they need to be on my plan. So I just wanted to point that out. But Trans Maryland, as far as name changes and all that, that's the perfect place to go.
I wanted to point out the intersectionality of the question, because what we need in this county is people who are knowledgeable about issues surrounding people who are non-married and who are living in situations in which their things need to be cared for. So this is really a question about living wills and trust and estate planning. So estate planning, if we are human, will happen to all of us because we are born and then we die, right? So that we have to determine if there is a place that will help gay people do estate planning is the issue, because we already know how to do those things. Now we just have to change the way that we think about how we do those things. I was a chaplain at a really busy hospital in Atlanta, and I got to experience how healthcare works for people who are married and non-married, and for people who are coupled and not coupled, and people whose genders don't match their sex organs. And there is quite a lot of work to do in the world with that. Just to get back to healthcare, I am one of those people that has to travel to Baltimore for simple things because I'm transgender, and it literally, anything that happens to me, the first thing what they want to do is to talk to the person who gives me tea, which really has nothing to do with the headache I have. So I've just moved all of my care to Baltimore because it's more trans affirming. But we need to find a way that we start to work within our systems to promote equity in the way that our systems serve us, because there's no reason that people can't have estate planning, no matter what their sexuality or gender is.
Yeah.
I
Other
also, and
questions?
just want to,
Oh, sorry,
and
Will,
just really
please.
quickly, I just want to say, because I put it in the chat, but I think it feels important to say, within our faith communities, and this may be controversial coming from somebody wearing a collar for some of us, We need to begin to divest ourselves of the notion that marriage is the ultimate goal or the only legitimate way of being in long-term relationship, because that then drives some of the implicit pushback that comes at queer people from this legal question. So there are lots of beautiful, diverse ways to be in loving, committed relationship within the queer community. It's one of the great gifts of being queer. If marriage is the only thing that we're allowing or that we believe gives people legitimacy, it's going to change the way that we fight for and enact laws in our country. So we in the church need to begin to do that work so that we can then partner with, be better allies and co-conspirators with queer communities for whom marriage is either not safe or not desired, or simply not the way that they want to express their love for the people with whom they're partnered.
Sure.
I think it's important to remember every time I think about marriage in the queer community, I always remember the disabled community. Many of them cannot get married and maintain the benefits that they have. So there is a subsection of our population that is discriminated against based on marriage. And those people too do not have the protections that they need for their partners if something happens. So yeah, the way that we look at marriage equality in our country is very limiting, and we have to work to give equity to all of the people.
Thank you, Becky. That was a deep question. Others? Lisa?
Yeah, I think we have a few questions in the chat.
Okay. Bill, would you like to give some of the questions from the chat, please?
Actually, I think we've hit them all. Appreciate the, I guess, Pastor Green or Dr. Johnson, if there's anything you noticed that I didn't, feel free to bring it up, but I think we've covered it.
Anyone else? Dylan, please.
Hi, I'm Dylan Grenham. I'm a high school teacher and educating myself on all this, also a parent of a trans child. And I know that lesbian and gay people are protected by the federal government, but trans people are not. Is it possible to pass laws in Montgomery County or in Maryland that are separate from the federal government so that trans people can be a protected class also?
Yeah. And Amena, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 2020 Bill of Rights that was passed in Montgomery County actually did make it gender expression and gender identity as a protected class. So we checked the box on that one. But I think, you know, again, there's always more work that we need to continue doing. But I believe that that legislation in 2020 covered that.
Okay. And how does that affect trans youth? Because when we were looking for healthcare, we had to leave Montgomery County also, but the places that would offer healthcare to trans people, you had to be 18 and older. So like Planned Parenthood, for instance, would only serve you if you were 18 and older. So what about for trans youth?
Yeah, so I think in terms of healthcare, one of the things that we talked about before, and that was one of the Maryland Trans Health Equity Act, where we extended Maryland Medicaid to cover trans people. It is for adults 18 and older. So there is still a lot of work we need to do with our younger population, our trans youth. And that is one of the things why having a clinic like that CCI is looking to open is very important, because they will be looking at programs specifically also for young people and trans people. But we have as a parent of someone who transitioned as a young person, there is still a lot of work we need to be doing. And I didn't mention this before but my background is I used to work for an organization called Advocates for Youth that worked with young people on their reproductive and sexual health. And not only for trans youth, but I have to say for young people and their sexual health across the board, we need a lot of work in our country and here in Montgomery County to make sure they can get the services they need. But we'd love to continue the conversation with you.
And I'll just say, yes, you're correct, Councilmember Stewart. And I do believe, I'll have to look up the policy, and I was trying to look it up real quick, that there is some protection in the state of Maryland for gender identity. However, you are correct in that the protections, start at 18. And honestly, and might be an unpopular opinion and get me in trouble, but I think that a lot of progressive places, and by progressive, I mean, places that have these laws that protect trans people, are trying to toe that line. And, this line of, we want to protect trans folks, but we know that we will isolate ourselves if we protect trans youth, and politically, I mean. And so I think that that's part of the reason it's really hard to get care for trans youth. And just in general, there's a difference between policy and practice. We have these policies, but you can change laws, but as Angela Davis said, you also have to change hearts and minds. And so that's where all of the things that we've been talking about today come in, with training, educating yourselves, and being an ally and all of that. But yeah, unfortunately, because of the world that we currently live in, it is difficult to get folks to pass things that will protect trans youth and get trans youth gender affirming care that they need. But again, Trans Maryland does a lot of work on policy and that sort of thing. So if you want to work with them and support them, you can feel free to contact me. I can connect you with the executive director there. This is absolutely one of the things that the community needs to help fight for. And not necessarily the person, I know you're a mom, you're going to fight for your kid, but I'm talking about us as allies, right? As a cisgender person who's not a parent, I need to be standing in that gap for you and with you.
And this is a place where a faith community can help, because we're in the business of changing hearts and minds, grounded in our theology of inclusiveness and respect for the dignity of every human being. And this is a practical way we can live into it in supporting this. So please.
Hi.
I'd also lift up the.
Sorry, go ahead, Will. Sorry, 1 second.
Sorry, Carrie, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just wanted to lift up the work of the Coalition for Inclusive Schools and Communities in Montgomery County, Philip Alexander Downey, and others who are doing really important work to begin building capacity to make some of these changes and to pull various co-conspirators together from across the perspectives of their interest in the work. So if you're looking for places to plug in or to get connected, that's just another resource that you might explore.
We are looking for places exactly like that to plug in, because when we do these town halls, we also try to couple them with a volunteer opportunity with organizations that are working in the field. So we're going to ask all of you to give us your suggestions on where we might have a volunteer opportunity. Carrie.
And this is Bill.
Yes.
I just want to point out another, there's a few suggestions that came in on the chat. I'll just point out one. It's called Transforming Hearts Collective. And I think the URL isn't too difficult. So it's www.transformingheartscollective.org. So that's a resource folks might want to note down.
Okay,
and
thank
Dr.
you so
Johnson, you just put one in as well. I don't know if you want to try to articulate that link.
That's the Coalition for Inclusive Schools. You can get to the Coalition for Inclusive Schools by livingyourtruth.org. And then you can search for it there. Thank you, Pastor Will, for bringing that up. I neglected to mention them, but yep, I put the link in the chat.
Okay, I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
So my name is Carrie, and I'm an LGBTQIA plus young adult. And when I was growing up, schools weren't as inclusive. But how can we make schools and like curriculums more inclusive for younger LGBTQIA plus kids and youth, so that way they don't have to feel as isolated and do all the work that I did when I was their age?
Great question. Who wants to tackle that one? I know you're not responsible for the Montgomery County Public Schools, but I'm sure you have thoughts nonetheless.
Well, talking about the Coalition for Inclusive Schools and Communities, I'm one of the coordinators, people, director, I don't know, of that group. And something that we are doing, Carrie, is that we are working with, some of us worked with the Anti-Hate Task Force to look at how schools were, how people were being affected in schools by hate, LGBTQIA plus people, and lots of other people. We developed recommendations from that in that task force that we gave to to Dr. Amena's office, and they're working on some of that. We are working within the school system with the Montgomery County School to just look at their curriculums that they have and see how we can be of help or service. I agree with you, Carrie, that that when we start the work of helping people to understand how lots of people live and develop, it's easier work to do than when we wait and when people are young, than when we wait until we're like 30 and we have a set way of doing things. I think that more could be done. It's definitely a way that church communities could get involved in fighting the narrative that LGBTQIA people are somehow haram or sinful or bad, because that is definitely the narrative that if you saw that acted out in Montgomery County over this summer and into the fall about the books that were coming into the schools, that was definitely the narrative, where there is a farther right narrative that says being gay or trans or whatever is wrong, and it's against faith in whatever way we see faith. And then another narrative that's like, we need to support people no matter who they are. But people like us, people of a liberatory faith, need to stand in the gap and say, we are also people of faith. And I find that people of liberatory faith, liberal faith traditions, sometimes don't do that well. We are not our best promoters when it comes to that. Sometimes we are just like, the message is that everyone is divine, everyone is loved, but we have to start off with, I am a person of faith and this is my belief, to counter that message of hate. So that's one way that we can do that.
I agree.
I would just
would
also
also-
add that the coalition is incredible and was so needed and does amazing work. So definitely get involved there. And also members of the school board need to hear from you all. And positive and when they're not doing great, because the job of the school board, it can be very difficult. When we had the continuing with the book issue, and they need to hear from the community. They need to hear from faith communities. They need to hear from other young people as well, because this is really it is critical to understand what we need to be changing in our schools. And I think I have experienced that sometimes people forget we have a school board. It's easy, right? Like most people don't even know we have a county council. That's okay. But it's also remembering that we have a school board. And I will just call out school board member Lynn Harris, who is a huge champion on these issues and great on these topics. And she needs to hear from people and don't just assume that if she's doing well or other school board members are doing well, you're like, oh, okay, they got this. Because they're hearing an awful lot, as Reverend Ali said, from folks who have differing viewpoints. And so even if you're agreeing with them, just sending an email or when you see them telling them that you support the position that they're taking or you want them to go further is really, really important that they hear from you.
Okay. We're supposed to wrap at 2:30, but we have, I think, Will, I apologize again.
I'm so sorry. This Zoom format makes it too easy to cut people off, and I
Right.
apologize if I've continued to do that. Two things. One a more practical suggestion, the other a little more difficult. In our congregations, even outside of our schools, we can make sure that our educational curriculum, that the resources that we're providing for parents and children reflect these values and commitments, right? We've heard it said already that a lot of this work begins at home. And that our young people are and have the capacity to be change leaders in this work. The more we can train people from an early age to be truly inclusive, the better they're going to be allies and co-conspirators in their schools fighting for change. So, we bought at our congregation, we bought all the books on the list that went to MCPS, and they are now on all of our shelves everywhere. We've made it a point to make sure that our curricula reflect our values for full inclusion. That's the practical suggestion. The other thing that I think we can do is begin to disentangle this conversation from sex education. We don't look at straight folk and think about them as their sex act, right? And yet the arguments that were made around the inclusive curriculum, a lot of them centered on the fact that we don't want our children receiving sex education, even though one of the books is called, I think it's The Prince and the Knight, and it's about a prince and a knight that fall in love. There's nothing inherently sexual about it, right? It's simply representative. And so the more we can begin to try to disentangle our conversations about queer folk from their sexual desire or their sexual love for one another, the better off we're going to be to show up and help begin to move this conversation forward.
Thank you. We should terminate now, but I want to give Lorraine, who's waited so patiently, the last question.
I'm Lorraine Nagy. I'm a nurse and I work helping people with insurance. And so in this conversation, I about healthcare and access to healthcare, the one thing that was not addressed was access to assisted reproduction. To my shock, many major insurance companies are refusing to help say a lesbian couple, a single mother, a gay couple in using assisted reproduction, being covered for assisted reproduction to create their families. That became a shock to me. I never understood that until I actually was engaged in it. And the reason why I'm saying it is that if the state legislatures start to address this issue and start to push back against the insurance companies, that's an opening. Because if we do it as individuals, they'll just say, here's the clinical policy bulletin, talk to your state legislatures. So I want to put that in your mind, because especially we're talking about young people that will want to establish families someday. This needs to change. And it's just an open door for you to be aware of that.
Thank you for that great suggestion. Well, I would like to take a minute to thank all of you for coming out on a cold afternoon for this town hall, and to thank all of our panelists who I think have given us really a lot of food for thought. This is just the beginning, as I said at the start, of a conversation and an education and learning process. But I, for one, am deeply grateful to all of you for everything that you have put in my head today and in my heart. And oh, you have one thing you want to say? Okay, great.
I just have one thing I want to say. It's something that I've noticed since moving to Montgomery County 2 years ago. This population has a large population of trans children in it. Many who transition before, they socially transition before like 3rd grade. They are socially transitioned, meaning nothing is happening on their body, to their bodies, but all of the social identifiers that we would have of them are different. And these children grow up, most of them grow up in heterosexual families and cisgender, definitely, families. And what happens is that somewhere along the way, they are disconnected from their trans identity. They determine I'm a girl or I'm a boy, and their families tell them, let's not talk about being trans because I want you to be safe. I don't want anyone to hurt you. I don't talk about your gender, what you were before. We're only going to talk about what it is now because I want you to be safe. And the thing is, as a parent, I completely understand where they're coming from, especially when we're watching the news and we're like seeing everything that happens every day in life. But the safety that you are claiming for your trans children now is a safety that separates them from their community in the long run. And as we know, as adults and young adults and youth, we all need community, right? So where does a trans youth who socially transitioned at 6 and then physically transitioned and has only had the message, you are this or you are that, a very cisgender message, where do they go when they need to talk about their gender? Where do they go when they need to figure out things related to gender? If they don't have transgender elders and the rest of the LGBTQIA community with them, if they're not plugged into that community when they're younger. So please be careful of the messages that you send your transgender children. Yes, they are male or female or non-binary or men or women or however they choose to be seen. Gentle days, yes. And they are still transgender and they need to be connected to their community to have a healthy and whole life.
Thank you. Okay. Well, please join me then in thanking this wonderful panel for everything they said today. we hope to have you back. And one last thing I would like to say is that St. John's Opportunity Shop is supporting this town hall. They're donating all of the proceeds of their sales yesterday, Saturday, which amounted to over $1,700, to an organization that we choose working in this field. So thank you to our Opportunity Shop as well. Thank you. Thank you.